Great. Well, thank you very much, Sandra, and thanks also to everyone at LAPAS, to Ineze, to Inga, to Ilse, and everybody here. It's a really great pleasure to be here, and I really enjoyed hearing the speeches and the videos, to hear, you know, from politics, from civil society, from education, how much vibrant activity is happening in Latvia focused on global competence, global citizenship. So really looking forward to sharing with you all here today. So I'll maybe just begin by speaking a little bit about who I am and who my organization is. And I have a few slides that I will go through, and then I'll share some thoughts on inequality and global citizenship education. And then we'll finish with one way of addressing inequality through global citizenship education, which is a code of good practice that we have been working on in IDEA and in Ireland. So firstly, as Sandra said, I'm Frank Geary. I am the director of IDEA, and IDEA, as well as being, you know, a word, is also an acronym for the Irish Development Education Association. I have some slides which I will just share as I speak. Bear with me for a moment. And I hope you can you see this? Okay, great, thank you. So IDEA is the national network for development education in Ireland, and we're a leading voice for our sector. I should pause firstly to say that we use the term development education in a very broad way. So our members use and work in global citizenship education, education for sustainable development, human rights education, really any related work focusing on education and global values. And we think it's important to have a space where everybody can come together and work together. And that's what our role is. We represent members involved in the practice, the promotion, the advancement of development education in, as we've heard from Sandra earlier, formal, non-formal and informal spaces. And together we work to highlight the role and raise awareness of the crucial role that global citizenship education plays in achieving an equal, just and sustainable future. So the topic of this conference on inequality and global citizenship education is absolutely at the heart of what we do. And in fact, we held a conference earlier this year, also remotely like this, which looked at this topic, looked at inequality and global citizenship education. So I'll draw on some of the speakers and thoughts that came from that conference. And I suppose maybe more importantly than all of that is that IDEA is part of a global community. So we've worked with LAPAS through things like the Bridge 47 network, which works across Europe and across the world, and Concord and other places. But that sense of being part of a global community is such an important part of what we do. We have around 80 members who range from development NGOs to educational organizations to youth sector, adult education, community development, trade unions, really a spectrum of education and civil society in Ireland. And I think very similar to those who are here today at this meeting as well. And essentially there's sort of three key things that we do, which is we focus on strengthening. So really building the capacity of our members. We also focus on pioneering, and by that we mean expanding the space, having broader conversations around global citizenship education. And as well as that, we focus on championing. So through communications, through advocacy, spreading the word about the importance of global citizenship education and its impact. So I'm going to try and move on to my next slide. In terms of what I'm going to say here today, this is really the key message. It's that inequality is a human choice, and that if we are working for global citizenship education, we must work to tackle inequality. If we are all global citizens, we are all equal, and we all have equal rights. And therefore, if we're working in global citizenship education, we absolutely have to work for this. I have a question that I want to ask to you, and I'm going to ask people to maybe write their responses in the chat. What do you think of when you hear the word inequality? And I'm not going to be able to see your responses because I have the full screen on here. So please, write your responses, have a look. If everybody can take a look and see what topics, what ideas are coming up, that would be great. And hopefully that will be just some food for thought for everybody. So I wanted to begin and to look at that question myself. And the way I want to do that is with a quote from Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General. And this is from a speech he gave on the 18th of July last year in 2020 called Tackling the Inequality Pandemic. And he says, inequality defines our time. More than 70% of the world's people are living with rising income and wealth inequality. The 26 richest people in the world hold as much wealth as half the global population. But income, pay, and wealth are not the only measures of inequality. People's chances in life depend on gender, family and ethnic background, race, whether or not they have a disability, and other factors. Multiple inequalities intersect and reinforce each other across the generations. The lives and expectations of millions of people are largely determined by their circumstances at birth. In this way, inequality works against human development for everyone. We all suffer the consequences. So to paraphrase that, Antonio Guterres is saying that inequality works against global citizenship. And that's really what we're here to speak about today. He speaks about that intersectional, the multiple inequalities that intersect and reinforce each other. And I'm guessing that in the chat, we're probably seeing examples of some of those multiple inequalities. So I wanted to, first of all, just look at economic inequality, because I think that brings us into a really key point, which is inequality as a social relationship. As that quote says, in 2019, 26 people had as much wealth as half of the world's population. And that, as many of you will know, comes from an Oxfam report. Oxfam also go on to say that the 22 richest men in the world have more wealth than all of the women in Africa. And they say that the world's 2,153 billionaires have more wealth than the 4.6 billion people who make up 60% of the planet's population. So those figures are incredibly stark. That inequality is incredibly stark. And a thinker who's done a lot of work around this is somebody who spoke at the IDEA conference a man called Richard Wilkinson, who, along with his colleague Kate Pickett, wrote this really influential book called The Spirit Level: Why Greater Equality Makes Societies Stronger. And Wilson and Pickett are epidemiologists. So they began their work looking at the correlation between inequality and health. And they found, through doing detailed statistical analysis, that there was a really strong link between inequality with physical health, with mental health, with educational achievement, with the levels of violence within a society, with how prominent imprisonment and draconian punishment is in a society. And what they found was, and they came to the conclusion, looking at all of these statistics and all of this data, that inequality creates a social relationship between inferior and superior. And that therefore inequality must be addressed as a social relationship. They also found that inequality within countries has a really substantial influence on shaping attitudes to other countries. So to whether a country is involved with international cooperation, with multilateral system, with overseas development assistance. And their conclusion on this was that if inequality is your experience of social relationships, of course it affects how you relate to other countries. So with that focus on inequality as a social relationship, that connects fundamentally to global citizenship, as global citizenship is all about our global social relations, about how we relate to one another, regardless of who we are and regardless of where we are, and how we support one another as well. So in terms of inequality and global citizenship, we've heard already about global competence and global citizenship. And I think one useful way into this is actually to go to poets and to look at metaphors and images that poets use. The Irish poet Seamus Heaney uses the phrase a human chain. And by that he means the connection between all people. And then in 1624, the English poet John Donne wrote a really famous poem in English called No Man is an Island. And excuse the gender, it should of course be no person is an island, but in 1624 that clearly wasn't a consideration. So he says, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of a continent, a part of the main. And he goes on to say, any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. So if no person is an island, if we are all part of a human chain, we cannot abide by the grotesque inequality that we're currently seeing in the world today. As Antonio Guterres said in that speech, and as I paraphrased, inequality and global citizenship are incompatible. And citizenship, as we know, involves taking action. So we must act and we must educate. So I also want to look at inequality and education, because often we focus on the global citizenship part, but the education part is just as important in relation to this. So again, I have another quote from a writer, this time from James Joyce, from his novel Ulysses. And in that, his main character says, it's all very fine to boast of mutual superiority, but what about mutual equality? I resent violence and intolerance in any shape or form. It never reaches anything or stops anything. And I think this last part, it never reaches anything or stops anything, is such a brilliant statement of the futility of inequality and violence. And it highlights, the impotence of inequality, that it never reaches anything. It never gets anywhere. It never achieves anything. And particularly for our times that we're living in, the fact that it never stops anything, and stopping, whether the climate crisis or COVID or many other things, is exactly what our societal challenges are today. So on this, inequality, I would say, is an addiction to the present, and it's a denial of the future. Inequality and the defense of inequality, they focus on the present, the here and now, above all, in a geographically and imaginatively limited way. They focus on this day only, in this place only. Right here and right now are the only things that count. And the consequences, whether for other people, other places, or for the future, are brushed aside and are ignored. And you know, as we all know, you don't have to look far to find inequality and the effects of inequality. You can look out your window, you can go to your nearest city or town, or easier again, you can pick up your phone, you can look on a news site or a newspaper. It's very difficult to avoid inequality. So the defense of inequality is not only a narrow focus on this day and this place, it's in many ways a distortion of this day and this place, because it requires an effort to ignore inequality. It requires people to actively ignore or downplay or refuse the evidence of inequality that's all around us. And so if the defense of inequality involves this denying of reality, of the imagination, of curiosity, of looking up and beyond the place where we are, inequality is the opposite of education. Because as we know, education is about opening, expanding the place where we are, allowing other people, perspectives, and realities to bump up against us. It's about connecting and making connections. It's fundamentally social. It's fundamentally about community. Education is hospitality. It's opening your doors and opening your space to others. And education expands the present. It widens the here and now, and it welcomes the future. Fundamentally, education is about potential and possibility. So in that way, education is the opposite of the defenders of inequality. And the continuing inequality that we face comes from that ignoring or dismissing the knowledge that we have. And therefore, education is central to tackling inequality. So whether we look at inequality from a focus on global citizenship or from a focus on education, it's clear that global citizenship education is absolutely central to tackling inequality, and that we must, if we're involved in this area, look at tackling inequality. So my next question then is, how can global citizenship education tackle inequality? And for this, I want to use one particular example, and this is a code of good practice, which we have developed with our members in Ireland. The code is based on 12 core principles, and then there's indicators and so on that flow from that. And it was developed it took us 2 to 3 years to develop this. We worked really collectively. It wasn't just a group of 3 or 4 people sitting in a room and writing things down. It was very much a collective process with the entire global education community in Ireland to create and agree to these principles, and then also to carry them out, because fundamentally that's what this has to be about. It has to be about improving our practice, improving our sharing with one another, and making us better at tackling the inequalities that we've just been talking about. And on this specific question, there's several of the principles in the code that I wanted to focus on. I don't know how readable that is. Hopefully it is readable, but I will also, there is a link on the next slide, which I might just quickly jump to, that if you can find the code on the IDEA website, which is you can see it here, ideaonline.ie. But the particular principles, so there's 3 things I wanted to highlight. The first is, in order to tackle inequality, we need to inform. And principle 1 and principle 2 of the code really focus on that. Principle 1 talks about contribute to knowledge, and it says here in Ireland, but it could be in Latvia, it could be in any other place. So contribute to knowledge about global development. And within that, we talk about examining connections between the lives of people locally and people globally, as well as other local and global actors. So really about making that connection between the learner's life and what is happening in other parts of the world. And secondly, the second principle talks about, and this one is so central to what we're talking about here, exploring the root causes of local and global injustices and inequalities in our interdependent world. And in particular in that, to highlight that we call on people to examine their own roles as global citizens as part of our exploration of the root causes of injustice, as well as looking at the causes and the effects of injustice and making that central to our educational work. The second thing we need to do is we need to engage. And Principle 4 and Principle 5 really speak to that. Principle 4 is about encouraging critical thinking in our exploration of local and global justice issues and seeking solutions. And that's really, focusing on diverse and challenging perspectives from both local and global perspectives. So exactly what I was talking about earlier there, the opposite of that denying and ignoring the realities of inequality, but actually working with those realities and engaging with them actively in open and respectful dialogue. And then how we do that is just as important. We need to live our values just as much as we need to speak of them. So using participatory creative methodologies is really central and important to that. And creating a space for learning that's relevant and appropriate for the groups that we work with. And the third thing is enable. So on that, I'd point to Principle 7 and Principle 8 of the code. In Principle 7, it talks about building skills for informed, meaningful action that is collective in nature. And within that, we talk about encouraging meaningful action based on participants' learning and analysis, using the voices and experience of those who are affected, linking learners with opportunities to engage with relevant action, and supporting participants to develop a range of approaches and skills that are relevant to their actions. And then finally, and I think this maybe is the most important one when it comes to this topic of inequality and global citizenship education, is Principle 8, which is about imagine and explore solutions for a better world. And by that, we mean support participants to imagine, examine, and actively explore different approaches to more sustainable and fairer ways of living. And I think maybe that I'll conclude with that, because global citizenship education needs to be an education for possibility. It needs to be an education that shows people what is possible and that tackling inequality is completely possible. So if we cooperate, collaborate, participate, work together, act together, and learn together in solidarity, we can do so. So I'm really looking forward to learning together with you for the rest of today and the rest of this session. Thanks very much.
Paldies, Frank, par vērtīgu stāstījumu, dalīšanos ar savu pieredzi un arī mūsu iesaisti apzinot šīs nevienlīdzībās dažādās sejas. Un atļaut tev mazliet ieskicēt, ko mēs domājam par šo nevienlīdzību, un kolēģi runā par atstumtību, par to, ka ir daudz nabadzīgu ģimeņu, par to, ka nespējam piepildīt ieceres, ka cilvēkiem ar īpašām vajadzībām ir mazas darba iespējas, tātad ir maz šo te izvēļu. Arī sabiedrībai daudz stereotipu, ka cilvēki no sociālās atstumtības riska grupām sabiedrībai neko labu nesniedz. Man prieks, ka mūsu komunikācijā piedalījās arī Sāra, jo viņai bija piemērs no Itālijas. Viņas prāt atšķirība ir starp vīriešiem un sievietēm darba tirgu, jo Itālijā, kā vienā no Eiropas valstīm, ir vislielākā darba samaksas atšķirība tieši starp dzimumiem. Tā kā milzīgs paldies, ka tu pavēri mums mazliet plašāk šo izpratni par nevienlīdzību, un tas ir skaidrs. Es arī saprotu, ka globālās kompetences pamatu veido ar šo te globālo kontekstu saistīta izpratne, rīcība, par ko tu ļoti daudz runāji, un pilsoniskā pozīcija. Atļauj man uzdot vienu jautājumu. Kas tavuprāt būtu pats svarīgākais, lai mēs paplašinātu savu redzējumu šajā kontekstā?
So just so I make sure I fully understand the question. So you're asking what's the most important aspect of global citizenship education? Is it to focus on to widen our work in this context? Is that? It's a really interesting question, and it's a difficult question. Because as we know, so many aspects of global citizenship education are linked together and connected together and are interlinked, the whole practice. But one that really comes to mind for me is the importance of it being a participatory approach. The importance of global citizenship education being really focused, not just on speaking about how important it is for people to participate in society as global citizens, or to participate in society as rights holders, you know, in the decisions that affect them, but also to participate in the educational process itself, so that the approaches and the ways that we work with global citizenship education are participatory. And in that way, I suppose we create an example of equality within, whether it's in a classroom or a youth group or an informal setting. So we live in that way the values that we are also speaking about in the content. It's a very good question and a very difficult question. I suspect my answer might be different if I was asked it in tomorrow, but that's what it feels like the answer today. So thanks.
Jā, paldies. Patiesībā šī tēma ir kā tāda izaugsme mums pašiem, un katru dienu mēs atrodam ar vien labākus veidus, kā iesaistīties, lai risinātu šo nevienlīdzības tematu. Un vēlreiz es tev vēlos pateikties par to, ka tu varēji būt kopā ar mums šobrīd, un ļoti ceru, ka tu turpināsi būt mūsu grupiņā arī vēl turpmāk, lai dzirdētu mūsu kolēģus. Es varbūt izmantošu iespēju uzdot Frankam vienu jautājumu no čatiņa. Frank, are you ready to answer the question? Jautājums ir sekojošs. Nevienlīdzības dēļ jau rodās problēma, ka ne visi spēj iegūt atbilstošu izglītību, pat ja viņi to vēlas. Kā to risināt?
So there was a slight glitch on the line. So Sandra, were you saying that it was not all people are able to access education, or not all people are accessing global citizenship education?
Te es vēlos jautāt Daigai Barančai. Varbūt, Daiga, jūs varat pieslēgties, jo šis jautājums ir ļoti vērtīgs mums visiem, un pajautāt precīzāk. Paldies!
Šeit es domāju vispār izglītību, piemēram, skolēni, vidusskolas, pēc vidusskolas varbūt vēlētos stāties kaut kur augstskolā, bet bieži vien, es domāju, ne tikai Latvijā, arī citur tas varētu būt problēma, ka viņi šo materiālo apstākļu dēļ nevar to izdarīt. Un bieži vien arī pēc 9. klases daudzi aiziet strādāt tikai tāpēc, ka viņu ģimene nevar atļauties. Vai arī tīri lauku bērni, piemēram, kas nevar atļauties. Tādā nozīmē es to domāju.
Paldies, Daiga. Frenks saprata?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Daiga. Yeah, I mean, that's a huge issue, and it's a really big issue in the Irish context as well. And it's something that, for example, to look at the specific example that you gave there of going to universities, in particular universities, that there is an issue of affordability. Some of the universities have set up access programs, essentially scholarship programs, but a bit more than scholarship programs, not because I think one of the issues they identified was that it's not just oftentimes about money. It's not just oftentimes about providing the funds to do this, although of course that is essential. But it's also about the social aspects in that, for example, you know, if young people are coming from a community where there is not a tradition of people going to university, or where they don't have role models, for example, of people going to university, or where their peers from school are entering the labor market, or are working, or, you know, in very different places in their lives, that social aspect can create a huge issue in relation to people staying on in universities, those who are lucky enough to get the opportunities. So there has been some interesting, I mean, the one I would think of as the Trinity College Access Program initiatives, where there has been attempts to do this in the Irish context. But I think your broader point, I think, is much more important, is that absolutely, you know, we can speak about the importance of tackling inequality as part of the content of our education work. But the reality is that within, you know, probably almost all education systems, there is significant inequalities, and significant inequalities that normally are linked, I would say, to socio and economic factors. And back to that point that Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett make, it's about inequality as a social relationship, and how that really distorts everything. You know, it distorts education, it distorts the education system. So these are absolutely huge challenges, but I suppose one way I would see of tackling these challenges is by having these discussions, by opening up the space within our education system, by opening up the possibility and potential of the young people who are going to be the ones who are going to come up with the ideas, not just younger people, but all people. But in particular, you know, we want people who are going to be bringing new ideas and new approaches to do things better, certainly than you know, my generation are doing them.
Jā, paldies, Frank, par atbildi. Daiga, es saprotu, ka atbilde ir tik ļoti plaša šobrīd, vai jūs kaut ko priekš sevis atradāt?
Nē, nu, protams, šeit būtu uzreiz jautājums, kas piedāvās tās iespējas, ja? Jo mums jau arī ir jau tā stipendija programma, bet vienkārši tā kā man konkrēti klasē ir bijis piemērs, tur iegūst šo stipendiju viens skolēns no visa novada, un viņam jāpierāda, cik viņš ir trūcīgs, lai nu, tiešām viņš tiktu tajā augstskolā, un tur jau tā lieta, ka nu, tas ir vienam no nezinu cik cilvēkiem, ja? Bet, protams, iespējas jau jāmeklē. Paldies!
Jā, liels paldies par jautājumu.